Okay, so in this video we're going to be looking through the SAID principle in the section of training principles. This section ultimately is trying to give you the knowledge of why certain training methodologies work and which training principles are common amongst all of the different methods that are effective. As we've kind of alluded to already, principles stand the test of time. They are the things that don't change. And there are many methods you can pick from, with all sorts of new methods coming out all the time. But training principles are always there, no matter what training method you decide to pick. The challenge in a world of information and slight information overload is cutting through all of that information that's being given to you to understand actually what are the key drivers of the changes that we want to make us a better athlete and ultimately improve our performance. There are many ways to go about this, but the key thing is to identify the underpinning principles which we operate around. And in this section, the SAID principle we're going to be looking at specifically. So to begin with, something which is specific is clearly defined or identified and is relevant to the individual or sport we're working with, as well as the adaptation we may be seeking to achieve. This is very important because oftentimes the adaptation we're seeking can be lost in the noise slightly around different training variables and the methods that we're picking. So when you come across a new method of training, that can be a slight sort of shiny object syndrome, and we can get distracted from the kind of key bit that drives adaptation that we want. And the other part there around it being clearly defined or identified is important, because the first step in any great decision making around program selection is what are we trying to change and what is the adaptation that we want in the body. Unless we understand that really clearly, it's quite hard to actually pick the effective training methods at the end of the decision making kind of flow chart, if you like. But if we know that from the start, it actually becomes a lot clearer. We have a lot more clarity of outcome of what it is that we're trying to actually change. So it's important that we understand this very clearly. The SAID principle is specific adaptation to imposed demands. So this ultimately means is that for a given stimulus, the body has a specific response. And there are many, many different types of stimulus that the body can experience. From one end of the spectrum, endurance sports are going to provide a particular type of stimulus to the body. And on the other end of the spectrum, really high power, short, explosive activities also provide a different stimulus to the body. And if you just simply looked at world-class sprinters versus world-class marathon runners, clearly there are different adaptations that exist there. Now, you can argue that athletes who are genetically predisposed to these activities are also drawn to it, and so that also compounds the kind of driving adaptations. But if you were to follow a sprint program for a year or follow a marathon program for a year, to give you a clear polarized example of that, it would be pretty clear that the body has got a set of specific adaptations that it will elicit in order to make you better at the thing you're trying to get better at. And that's why the body's so smart. But in contradiction to that, if we're doing the things that we don't need to be doing that won't improve our performance, then we're not giving the body the signal it needs to actually create the adaptations that we want. So that's why we need to get really clear on this overall principle. So what we mean here is that tissues only adapt to the stimulus that they experience. So this is a very, very key point, which again is often missed. But a tissue will only respond to a stimulus that it experiences. So it doesn't really matter how it experiences the stimulus, only that it does experience the stimulus. But unless we understand what it is we want this tissue to experience, it's very hard to ensure that that does actually happen. So if we're getting distracted with all sorts of crazy training methods, or we are looking at, let's say, for example, methods like CrossFit, where the stimulus is spread across lots of different areas, then the precision is lacking in order to give a very specific stimulus. Now, that's not a criticism of CrossFit. I think it's fantastic, and I think it's a great method for improving CrossFit performance and general health. But that's a good example where you're trying to increase performance across a number of different areas, and therefore the kind of response of those different stimuluses is going to be a little bit lacking. So if we're trying to get a really specific stimulus, training across all these different methods simultaneously, it makes that a little bit harder essentially to achieve. Whereas if we're really precise around sprint speed or maximum aerobic speed or lower body power, whatever it might be, we can put more of our training resource towards making that happen. So the overall implications of this is that, one, the body's incredibly smart. It will adapt to exactly what it's given. And it is a very adaptable machine, the body. So training's got to be specific to the adaptation that we want. And ultimately, impacting performance requires a razor blade, not a shotgun. So the shotgun approach would be, we're going to try and train lots of different methods simultaneously and without a great deal of precision. On the other hand, the razor blade approach is, we're very clear on a specific adaptation through using specific principles that underpin that adaptation to give the body the signal that it needs to adapt in order that we improve our performance on the pitch, which is ultimately the test of a great program. Is, are we actually getting better as an athlete on the pitch, not just in general, getting better at training? Because it's great to be getting better at training, getting stronger and faster in specific exercises, but unless we're actually getting better as a hockey player, it doesn't really matter necessarily. So in this example here, we've got adaptations to the tissues are specific to the stimulus that they experience. So if we're using really heavy back squats, for example, and going maximally above 85 to 90% of 1RM on back squats, the stimulus that the tissues are experiencing at that point is going to be very different from that of long distance running, for example, where different stimuli are being experienced, the tissue is experiencing different things, and therefore it believes that different responses are required. So if we're trying to improve our ability to run long distances, then we need to be running long distances. And the strength training can, obviously help us to tolerate greater training stresses, which will facilitate the ability to do the high volumes of training. But you can't get away from the fact that if you're an endurance-based sport, then you need to be able to tolerate higher amounts of training volume. If, on the other hand, we're trying to increase our ability to maximally produce force in the knee extensors through the quadriceps, then the back squat might be an option you might pick, or a leg press or something along those lines. But again, if we said the adaptation here is increased maximal force expression at the knee and knee extension, then by using this method we are quite likely to achieve that. You could also argue that to make it even more specific, you could do something like a leg extension or a leg press to kind of minimize the effect of spinal compression loading and that kind of thing, for sure. But the kind of basic principle there remains. So what we want to try and achieve must be met in order for adaptations to occur. And that's the key bit to take from this so far. So an example in action here. Hypertrophy in general, so muscle building, is driven by three key principles. Mechanical tension, which is heavy loading will increase the amount of mechanical tension that a muscle will experience. Metabolic stress, through minimizing the rest periods that you experience, it basically helps to minimize any clearance of metabolites that will build up, and those are what help to provide the signal for hypertrophy. And then muscle damage, again, through sufficient training loads that tax muscle tissue, you start to get damage to the tissue as well. It may or may not be relevant for hypertrophy, as research shows us, but these are the three key principles that underpin this. Now, how this occurs is less important than the fact it actually occurs at all, if this makes sense. So as long as the tissue experiences these principles, it doesn't matter how that occurs. So whether you're lifting heavy objects all day and your job involves, lugging around heavy things, you may find yourself experiencing hypertrophy because the tissues involved are experiencing high mechanical tension. It might be lots of work, and so they're getting a small amount of rest periods, and so getting metabolite build-up, maybe some muscle damage involved there, and so hypertrophy occurs. And bodybuilders in the gym are obviously taking this to a greater degree here, but the loading that they're experiencing, again, is causing hypertrophy to occur because the principles are being met. And that's the ultimate thing to take away from this section, at least, is that how an adaptation occurs is less important than ensuring that the signal is being provided to ensure that the adaptation occurs in general. And the take home for hockey players so far is that trying to ensure that the adaptations you're trying to seek in order to improve your performance is the key thing, and not the methods that you pick to get there. So here's a quick summary. If you wanted to induce hypertrophy in the system, then high load strength training above 1 RM, close to failure, around 1 repetition away from failure or close to failure, will help to elicit hypertrophy because it meets those principles. If you want to try and increase tendon stiffness, then high load isometrics of 3 to 5 seconds at really, really high maximal loading helps to stiffen tendons, which can help with things like maximal sprinting, change direction, that kind of thing. And then tissue capacity, so ability to withstand repeated loading. It's going to require high volumes of loading, so low intensities, and trying to get like at least 4 minutes of work in total out of a training session into a given tissue. And that could be things like 8 sets of 30 seconds. So just in those 3 examples, there's 3 different adaptations: muscle growth, stiffness of a tendon, capacity of a tissue to withstand loading. They all require different stimuli to achieve this. If we're trying to induce hypertrophy through high load isometrics, that could occur, but it's less likely to than dynamic strength training through full ranges of motion above 70% of 1 RM. Equally, if we're trying to induce tendon stiffness, but we're doing really high volumes of light work, you're just not giving the signal to the tendon that it needs to increase in stiffness. So that's just a clear example there of how it's important to ensure that the signal is aligned with the adaptation that you want. So ultimately, what does this mean for hockey players? Because obviously we're trying to draw this all back now. These underpinning principles that are general in nature, but do have an importance here in terms of laying the foundation for hockey-specific training. Number one, it doesn't matter how adaptations are achieved, only that they are achieved. So it doesn't matter what method you pick, just that training principles are met that induce certain stimuli in the body that cause the body to respond and adapt in the way that we want. Specific to hockey does not mean specific adaptation. So just because something looks like hockey doesn't necessarily mean that the adaptations we want in the body are going to be met. So if you're doing, let's say, a resisted hockey shot or something, that may look like it is specific to hockey, but if the limiting factor is maximal force expression in the lower body, then there's no way that we're inducing overload, for example, which we're going to be talking in a second. So ensuring that you're clear on what adaptations that you want, what's important to you, what's limiting you, and once you're clear on that, it becomes a lot more simple in terms of providing a training program that is specific to you and your unique needs as a hockey player. So overall take home from this should be ensure that you are clear on what you're trying to change, ensure that the program you're doing drives that change overall. And just the one reference from this, again, the slides will be available, so have a little look through. A very useful paper around hypertrophy if you'd like to read more on that. So again, hopefully this section is providing general overview of training principles which are applicable across multiple different sports, but drawing it back to hockey, ensuring that the adaptation you want is being achieved is more important than how you go about achieving it. So I hope that's an important take home for you. And looking ahead to the next section, we're going to be looking at assessment and screening. So by this point, we have understood the physical demands of hockey, both from a running and injury perspective. We've understood the underpinning training principles that drive adaptation in the body. And then now we can look to say, now that we understand demand, we can start to assess the capability of individual players to build programs based on principles that get you to the point you're trying to get to. So I hope that's been good, and looking forward to seeing you in the next section.